This is Sleepy History, a nightly companion where history is told softly for calm and sleep. I'm Dr. Hugh, a Harvard historian. Each evening, a new chapter. If this helps you rest, a quiet like and subscribe keeps the candle lit. Tonight's topic, the Continental Army's food crisis. Let's begin. In the dim glow of a lone lamp, I find myself sifting through old, tattered diaries and crumbling letters, the gentle turning of the pages like the rustling of dry leaves. Each one is a gentle whisper from the War of Independence. The Continental Army emerges from these whispers not as an irresistible force, but as a collection of cold, hungry men in threadbare coats. One pictures them huddled around sputtering campfires, their uniforms ragged, their shoes disintegrating, their stomachs painfully empty. In those early years of the Revolution, General Washington's beleaguered troops wanted for everything: arms and ammunition, proper clothing, sturdy shoes, even reliable shelter against the winter wind. Yet, of all these wants, the most persistent and punishing was the want of food. In truth, the very foundation of an army is its belly. Without adequate provisions, muskets and bravery alone could not prevail. And so, in this late hour, let us wander slowly through that half-forgotten landscape of hardship, exploring how the Continental soldier scrounged and suffered for his daily bread. We shall see not a story of grand battles, but of sustenance sought and often missed in the quiet, desperate moments between. Almost imperceptibly, our focus settles on a single image, a promised ration, written neatly on paper, held up against the gaunt reality of an actual soldier's day. In November 1775, the Continental Congress decreed an official daily ration for each man, an idealized bill of fare meant to hearten the troops and fuel their fight. It was generous by the standards of the age, at least on parchment. One imagines the ingredients arrayed like a comforting still life, a generous portion of hearty meat, fresh beef, perhaps, or rich pork, a solid pound of bread or flour, and a comforting side of legumes. There were nourishing extras too. Milk, when obtainable, rice or Indian meal to thicken stews or bake into cakes. To wash it down, Congress dared to include a daily draft of spruce beer, tart with evergreen tips, or its equivalent in cider, with a sweet allowance of molasses. They even added a dollop of vinegar now and then, hoping its sharpness might ward off scurvy. This ration was a portrait of plenty, wholesome and abundant on paper, almost enough to make a common farmer envious. But paper rations do not fill real stomachs. The Continental soldiers soon discovered that the official allotment was a fiction rarely realized. The fragile supply lines of the revolutionary cause meant that the full ration almost never reached the men in the field. Wagons broke down, supplies spoiled or were mislaid. Local farmers hid their produce to save it from requisition. Thus, against Congress's hopeful promise of beef and bread, the actual meals of the soldiers were scant and monotonous. A young private, Joseph Plumb Martin, later remembered with wry bitterness that starvation here rioted in its glory during some encampments. In his memoir, he painted the stark scene: an army supposed to be amply fed, yet in reality the troops were starved, often nothing to eat for days on end. We can almost see him, half smiling in hindsight at the grim irony, as he noted that the famous phrase, "times that tried men's souls," would have been better said as times that tried men's bodies too. And indeed, hungry bellies proved just as dangerous an enemy as any redcoat. Contemporary accounts from many soldiers echo Martin's despondent refrain. At the bitter winter camp of Valley Forge in 1777, a general cry went up among the tents one freezing December evening: "No meat, no meat." The voices carried over the snow, hollow and half playful in their misery, until even the distant hills seemed to echo the soldiers' complaint. When an officer inquired what the men had for dinner, a few gestured back with gallows humour. "Nothing but fire cake and water, sir." By fire cake, they meant a meagre paste of flour and water, baked directly on the coals, ashes for seasoning, hunger for spice. It was a far cry from the sumptuous ration listed by Congress. In another lament from that winter, one colonel recorded that in a span of 3 days, his men received a mere half-pound of meat each, a cruel fraction of the intended bounty. Such tales of half rations and empty mess tins were not isolated. They were the common experience of Washington's army throughout the long war. It is sobering to consider, in tranquil retrospect, just how insufficient even the full ration would have been to sustain a hard-marching, hard-fighting soldier. Historians estimate that if a Continental soldier ever did receive his complete daily allowance, it might yield enough perhaps for a man at rest, but not for one labouring to build forts, haul cannon, or withstand the cold. Modern soldiers are often provisioned with nearly twice the energy to fuel their exertions. The Continentals, by contrast, were fighting a caloric deficit from the outset. In truth, many of Washington's men were always in a state of semi-starvation. Even when food was issued in quantity, it was often of poor quality or barely edible. One young soldier remembered choking down rock-hard biscuits. So hard, he said, they were enough to break the teeth of a rat. Another recounted receiving nothing 1 week but a few pounds of fire cakes and a bit of salt herring, until the poor diet left him profoundly weak and unwell. We can imagine him, throat dry and weary, trying to swallow a dry morsel of hard bread, whistling it into digestion as one diary phrased it, pretending it a feast. The men grew weak, their faces drawn and gaunt, and yet on they marched. Now, in the quiet, let us picture a different scene, a better day, when the army's supply wagons have arrived and the men have something to cook. What then? How did these hungry soldiers prepare their food when fortune smiled enough to provide it? The material culture of cooking in the Continental Army reveals ingenuity born of necessity. Soldiers were organized into small mess groups, usually 6 men or so who pooled their provisions and labor. In a best-case scenario, this little fraternity of comrades might have a few basic tools at its disposal. Perhaps a kettle or cookpot of iron, maybe a skillet or kettle lid to use as a rudimentary frying pan, and a camp kettle to boil water or stew meat. The camp kettle was the heart of it all, a precious thing, usually made of cast iron or thick tin, with a bale handle to hang from a tripod over the fire. Into this soot-black pot would go whatever the day's ration provided. Cuts of meat, often salt pork or stringy beef, handfuls of dried peas or rice, a bit of biscuit crumbled up, maybe some shreds of dried pumpkin or wild herbs for flavor. Slowly, quietly, the contents would bubble and simmer into a kind of stew or porridge. One can almost hear the quiet hiss of moisture hitting the coals, and smell the acrid wood smoke mingling with the faint, comforting scent of the stew. This method, boiling everything together, was no accident. It was encouraged by officers and surgeons who knew that stewing could extract every possible nutrient into the broth and soften even the toughest salted meat. A warm, soupy stew could keep a half-starved man alive, where roast meat alone might not. It was said that a soldier's stew, left to burble all afternoon in the communal kettle, absorbed not just ingredients, but the camaraderie of those who tended it. A melting pot of endurance and fellowship, if you will, quietly nourishing body and spirit. Yet even in these best-case moments of cooking, the soldiers faced material privations. Eating utensils were scarce as hen's teeth. Many men had no bowls, no plates, not even a spoon of their own. They improvised as they could, fashioning crude spoons whittled from wood, using clean, flat pieces of bark or scrap leather as platters, and sipping thin stew straight from their cupped hands or an upturned helmet. An observer at the time would have found the scene primitive. Nasty cookery is how one army surgeon described the soldiers' makeshift kitchens. Around a small fire, 6 lean men crouch. A single iron pot hangs in the flames, its contents bubbling softly. One stirs with a stick. Another carves a spoon out of a scrap of pine, almost meditatively. They scoop the meager broth in turn, slurping quietly, with smoke-reddened eyes and an almost thankful silence. The stew is plain and half-burnt, bits of ash swirling in it, but to them it is a kingly meal. When the army was on the move, however, even that iron kettle could become an unbearable burden. Marching all day under a hot sun, or through sucking mud, weighed down by musket, ammunition, bedroll, and the infamous 40 rounds of cartridges. The addition of a heavy cast-iron pot was enough to break the strongest back. Joseph Plumb Martin, that keen chronicler of the common soldier's life, tells a quietly poignant anecdote of a night march to White Plains in 1778. He and his messmates had been issued a camp kettle the size of a milk pail made of solid cast iron. Consequently, Martin notes dryly, it was exceedingly heavy. Hour after hour, the men trudged in darkness, each step a little slower, the kettle swinging empty from aching arms. Hunger gnawed at them. They had nothing to cook in that pot after all, their provisions long since consumed, and fatigue pressed like a weight on their shoulders. Finally, climbing a hill in the wee hours before dawn, Martin sat down, utterly exhausted, and told his comrades he could carry the iron pot not one step further. One can hear the resignation in his voice as he recounts how the others, equally worn out and disgusted, agreed. Of what use was it, they murmured. They had no food to prepare and no strength to spare. In a moment of quiet decision, they all rose and left the kettle by the side of the road. Martin gave it a push, sending the pot rolling down a small embankment where it came to rest against a fence post in the darkness. There they abandoned it without ceremony, and that, he writes, was the last I ever saw of it. When dawn broke and the column reformed, it turned out that many a mess had done the same, discarding their heavy kettles in the night. The army marched on, lighter but hungrier than ever, freed from their iron bondage at a cruel cost. This small act of surrender, forsaking even the tools of cooking, speaks volumes about the desperation that stalked Washington's army. Still, those soldiers persevered, adapting wherever they could. The commissary department, charged with feeding the army, continually grappled with substitutions and makeshifts to stretch the scant supplies. Meat, for example, was supposed to be issued daily, but delivering fresh beef or pork to thousands of troops across muddy roads was a logistical nightmare. Without modern refrigeration, fresh meat would spoil quickly, especially in summer. So salted and preserved meats became the norm. In cooler months, fresh beef might reach the men, only to be gone within a day or two of butchering. If a multi-day supply of meat was handed out, soldiers sometimes half-salted the excess themselves to keep it from rotting, though often it went bad anyway. Salt pork and salt fish, dried cod or herring, were staple issues, heavy with brine, needing lengthy soaking and boiling, but at least they were protein. The men grew exceedingly tired of salted meat, yet they preferred that to no meat at all. One ingenious attempt to vary the diet was a mandate that each soldier should get fresh meat at least a few days a week. The official ratio settled on 4 days of the week, with salted meat, 2 days fresh beef, and 1 day fish. But even this modest goal was seldom met in practice. When it was, fresh meat often arrived in pitiable condition. Scrawny cattle driven to camp, slaughtered in haste, their beef distributed in large chunks that would barely keep a day in the heat. Bread, the other pillar of sustenance, presented its own trials. Ideally, the army would be supplied with fresh baked bread or soft flour loaves from organized bakeries. In reality, erecting and maintaining bakeries in the field was almost impossible during active campaigns. At static winter quarters, ovens could be built, and skilled bakers, often soldiers or camp followers, set to work, turning out loaves of coarse bread when flour was ample. But on the march, bread was a luxury rarely seen. Instead, contractors provided durable ship's biscuit, better known as hardtack, those hard, dry crackers baked to an adamant firmness so they could survive months in a barrel. Hardtack did not mold easily and could be transported to the ends of the earth, but it was famously unpalatable. Soldiers would tap the rock-like biscuit on a table to knock the weevils out, or soak it in water or coffee if they had any, to soften it enough to chew. Joseph Plumb. Martin's quip about biscuits cracking a rat's teeth was no exaggeration. Many a soldier left the dining tent with broken molars after rashly biting into an unsoftened piece. Worse still was when the flour itself was issued raw. There were occasions when all the commissaries could deliver was bags of flour or coarse cornmeal to the troops, without any means to properly bake bread. In such times, the men had to improvise their infamous fire cakes, mixing a little flour with water, perhaps with a pinch of salt, perhaps not. They would smear the paste on a flat stone or wrap it around a stick and set it near the campfire, hoping to cook it into a crude ash-covered cake. One soldier described this process as making a cake in a horrible manner, the dough rolled in dirt and ashes to bake. The result was barely more than burnt dough, often charred outside and gooey inside, but it was food of a sort. At Valley Forge, when even flour ran low, men resorted to truly desperate measures, attempting to extract nourishment from whatever meager materials were at hand, things never meant for consumption. Such extreme measures were rare, mercifully, but the very fact they occurred at all etches for us the stark outline of the soldier's hunger. To ease this relentless want, the men learned to supplement their official rations however they could. Foraging became a daily ritual and a necessary evil. Sometimes it was authorized, even ordered. Often it was not. On a bright June day in 1777, as the Continental Army camped at Middlebrook, New Jersey, General Washington issued a remarkable order to his troops. Noting that the fields and woods around the camp abounded in wild greens, he encouraged his men to gather these natural provisions to enrich their diet. As there is plenty of common and French sorrel, lamb's quarters, and watercresses growing about camp, the order read, the soldiers should make constant use of them, as they are very conducive to health and help prevent scurvy. Each regiment's officers were instructed to send parties out every morning to collect these wild vegetables and distribute them to the men. We can picture those soldiers in the dewy dawn, wading into patches of sorrel and cress by a stream, the gentle rustle of leaves as their rough hands gathered greens, perhaps glad for something fresh and tangy after endless salt meat. The troops knew well the value of vegetables, which they tellingly referred to as sauce. In their dialect, sauce meant anything served alongside the main ration to make it more palatable. And necessary sauce was their term for the vitamins and variety that only greens could provide. General Washington and his officers, like Nathaniel Greene, understood this. Greene even wrote to Washington that a putrid fever had swept through his brigade, likely because the men were feeding too freely on animal food with no vegetables. He proposed that part of the meat ration be withheld, and its value given in money, so the troops could buy the necessary source of fresh produce. So important were vegetables to health that Congress later added sauerkraut or vinegar as weekly issues when possible. Yet, authorized measures could only go so far. In the desperate theaters of war, unauthorized foraging, often indistinguishable from outright theft or plundering, became common. Starving soldiers helped themselves to whatever edible things they could find in the surrounding countryside. They raided orchards for apples and peaches, dug up farmers' potatoes and turnips under cover of night, snared chickens from barnyards, and slaughtered the occasional sheep or hog belonging to local civilians. Such actions, of course, strayed outside the bounds of military order and propriety, and officers tried to clamp down on them with varying success. But one can hardly blame the men. As one weary surgeon at Valley Forge wrote, "On some days, a man felt so faint with hunger that he was tempted to steal fowls if I could find them, or even a whole hog, for I feel as if I could eat one." That wry confession, scribbled in a private diary, speaks to the powerful instinct that overwhelmed ordinary scruples when bellies were empty. It was a dangerous game. Pillaging nearby farms risked alienating the very civilians the army was protecting, and Washington was keenly aware that uncontrolled plundering could turn public sentiment against his troops. So even as he sympathized with his soldiers' plight, he maintained discipline where he could. Offenders caught stealing from locals might be flogged, for example, to set an example. Still, in the cruel winter of 1778, Washington himself admitted with despair that it was astonishing the half-naked, half-starved Continental soldiers had not mutinied or dispersed altogether. "For some days past," he wrote, "there has been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been a week without any kind of meat, and the rest 3 or 4 days. Only the soldiers' patience and loyalty," he said, "kept them at their posts when every instinct must have urged them to go find food at any cost." He was, in his measured way, marveling at their resilience, even as he pleaded for help to feed them. Thus did the Continental Army wage a constant, quiet battle behind the battle, a battle to fill their stomachs and sustain life. Hunger was their steady companion, a spectre that stalked them from the hills of New Jersey to the rivers of New York, from the Carolinas to Yorktown. The administration of the army, from Congress to the Commissary General, was never blind to this crisis, though they often seemed powerless to solve it. They wrote reports, passed resolutions, reorganized supply departments, and sent out wagon loads of provisions, all in hopes of averting starvation. Yet shortages continued to plague the ranks, a systemic failure born of an infant nation's poverty and inexperience. The soldiers, in the end, survived more on their own wits and forbearance than on any consistent logistical success. They learned to endure with what little nature and fortune provided: a bit of flour, a scrap of salt meat, a wild onion pulled from frozen ground. These became the tenuous lifeline of liberty. Think now of Joseph Plumb Martin and his comrades as the war drew on. They were no longer wide-eyed boys in 1775, dreaming of glory. They were gaunt, weather-beaten men, veterans while still in their 20s, souls tried in the furnace of adversity. Martin humorously recalled how, by the later campaigns, the troops valued certain things above all else. A warm fire, a dry shelter, and a full belly were the true treasures of soldiering life. When those were granted, even briefly, spirits rose. When they were lacking, as they so often were, the soldiers met hardship with a grim sort of good-natured stoicism, joking about fire cake and water even as they suffered. It is almost mesmerizing to contemplate how these men, half-starved and inadequately clothed, kept marching, kept fighting, kept believing in the cause. They complained in diaries and letters, as any hungry man would. Yet time and again, they answered the call to stand fast, to engage the enemy, to persevere. General Washington, who saw them shiver and struggle at Valley Forge and Morristown, never ceased to admire their fortitude. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the Continental Army's triumph in the end was as much a victory of endurance as of strategy. The British generals may have scoffed that the rebels were ill-fed and ill-kept, but those rebels would not break. As our meditative journey reaches its end, let us reflect quietly on the image of a common Continental soldier, maybe on the eve of battle or a long march. He crouches by a small fire under the stars. The night is cold. The smoke curls upwards slowly. In his tin cup, there might be a few spoonfuls of thin stew. Not much, but perhaps enough to warm his belly. Around him, his messmates wrap their threadbare coats tighter and share a murmured joke or two to lighten the gloom. They think of home, of the meals their mothers and wives used to set on the table. Fresh bread, hot broth, a slice of roasted meat, almost able to taste those memories. And then a breeze rustles the dry leaves, and he is back in the present, chewing a leathery bit of salt pork and washing it down with cold water. Despite it all, a subtle smile comes to his lips. He feels, at that moment, a quiet pride that he is still here, that he endures when many would have given up. The revolution has tested not only his ideals, not only his patriotism, but his very flesh and blood. I often found, Martin wrote years later, that those times not only tried men's souls, but their bodies too. I know they did mine, and that effectually. Yet here he sits, body and soul together, unbroken and unbowed. In the darkness, a sentry calls out the hour. The weary soldier finishes his meagre supper, lies down on the hard ground by the fading fire, and pulls a thin blanket over himself. Tomorrow there will be another march, another ration, perhaps, another challenge. But for now, in these gentle moments before sleep, he allows himself a final thought, a hope, like a sliver of dawn on the horizon, that come victory or defeat, this hunger too shall pass. And with that hope quietly glowing within him, he closes his eyes, and the camp at last grows still.